Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depends on where you are. Thank you for joining us for the webinar on Syria after 10 years of the conflict. Uh, of course, the number, it can tell part of the story, not the whole story, but according to the World Food Programme, 9.3 million Syrians were food insecure in 2020. Would that mean almost half of the population of Syria right now, with an additional 2.2 million at risk of becoming so? Prices of food items have soared, salaries have stagnated, and domestic food production has taken a dive. As of February 2021, almost 5.6 million Syrians were refugees. Of course, this is the number from the UN, and always the UN account only the registered refugees. We do believe that the number is higher than 5.6, but at least this is a third of the population. The majority of whom are concentrated in neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and of course in European countries like Germany and Sweden. And another 6.2 million are internally displaced people, 2.5 million of whom are children. This dire humanitarian crisis promises to continue as long as there is no resolution to the political stalemate in the country, as the Assad refuses to allow a peaceful transition of power to a democratic system of government. After a decade of the Syrian uprising, the de facto Syria has been divided into three general areas, the borders of which have not seen much change over the last 2 years. The first and largest controlled by the Assad regime, where 12 million Syrians still alive there, and the area lacks insufficient necessities of food or cooking oil, or as any government services like electricity, water, drinking water, and other state services. At the same time, the second region, it's one that controlled by the American-supported Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces in the northern east of Syria, and the third area where they have largest number of the IDPs, where the area controlled by the Syrian opposition backed by Turkey. Uh, we fortunate to have four of great panelists coming from different backgrounds who contributed to the Syrian crisis through the years. And we have Dima Moussa. She's a long friend. She's an Syrian-American lawyer and a member of the Syrian Constitutional Committee and the Syrian National Coalition and the Syrian Women's Political Movement. Also, we have Hamzah Almustafa, who's the director of the Syria television, who's broadcasting from Istanbul, and PhD candidate and researcher in the Middle East politics at the University of Exeter. Also, we have Yasmine Nahlawi. She's a legal consultant leading a project that investigates and builds dossier of international crimes committed in Syria to help bring about and assist in their prosecution. She has a PhD in international law from Newcastle University, and she's the author of Responsibility to Protect in Libya and in Syria, Mass Atrocities, Human Protection, and International Law. And last but not least, Assaad Al Achi. He's a Syrian civil society activist and the executive director of Baytna, Syria, from Gaziantep. I will give 10 minutes or 12 minutes to each of the speakers. And then after that, we'll have Q, such of a debate between even actually most of the panelists will agree on most of the issues will be raised. We'll have open for questions. Anyone interested? That we have Q&A, and then also you can send your questions through the center YouTube channel. We'll start with Dima. Dima, please.
Thank you, Radwan, and thank you, the Arab Center, for organizing this discussion and inviting me to join with the other distinguished guests. Good morning, or good afternoon, or evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Um, I want to start from the get-go, is to realistically remind ourselves and everyone that with each passing day, Syria and Syrians are slipping further down the priority list internationally. But more alarmingly, probably, is on the US foreign policy agenda. This is something that I will touch on a little later. Admitting this sometimes is understood by some to mean that we are sitting around waiting for the international community to do something or impose something on us. This is absolutely not the case. Instead, it should be an incentive for all of us collectively to determine what is it that we can work on to push the international community as much as we can, and to do work at the Syrian level within these coordinates. And I think this type of event is falls under that. So this makes it important for us to work and intensify actually the work at all levels: political, civil, legal, humanitarian, even on the media level and advocacy. Today, what we are witnessing in Syria, and I think we all agree on this, is that there's a true crisis that is getting more compounded and complex, which means the solution is not a simple one either. It would still have to address the roots of the problem, which remain in place today and are worsening exponentially due to the policies that had and continue to impoverish the majority of the population economically, socially, and politically, which were originally the reasons why Syrians came out in 2011 in their revolution. So the roots of these problems remain mainly within the Syrian regime, because a closer look at Syria pre-revolution would reveal the existence of much of what we are seeing today and witnessing and have witnessed over the last 10 years. They were in existence in Syria pre-2011, and I think all of us who lived in Syria know this. And I know this is starting to sound like it's just we're repeating it, but it truly is that the only way out of this is through a comprehensive political solution, a roadmap for which was drawn by the Geneva Communique of 2012 and later through Security Council Resolution 2254, which was adopted unanimously in December 2015. And, me being a member of the opposition, we remain committed to the political solution, and I think all Syrians are, through the full implementation of this resolution, which outlines the steps for the political process. And I will just mention them as a reminder: establishing a credible, inclusive, non-sectarian governance, drafting a new constitution, and free and fair elections pursuant to the new constitution with all Syrians, including members of the diaspora, eligible to participate. But we shouldn't forget that 2254 also has some humanitarian or other aspects that are supposed to build trust between the Syrian sides and among Syrians in order to create the appropriate environment in which this political solution can be implemented and sustained. Those relate to things like refugees, IDPs, detainees, the missing, and humanitarian assistance, among other things. The other thing about 2254 is national consensus, at least on paper, about the political solution in Syria. Where things get tricky is when we look at its implementation or attempts thereof so far. Today, the political process remains at a deadlock, and we as opposition have engaged positively in all the attempts to get the political process moving, and have yet to find a serious partner on the other side of the table. This is not new. This started since 2014 when the Geneva process started. But one good recent example of that is the Constitutional Committee, of which Dr. Radwan mentioned that I am a member, had its first meeting in October, at the end of October 2019. So we're talking about almost a year and a half ago. We have had so far 5 rounds of the Constitutional Committee, and thus far have yielded 0 results. The last round, unlike the first, which was at the end of January, unlike the first 4, we had an agenda that specifically was about constitutional principles And we thought that this would make it harder to evade talking about the constitution, but really the regime side still managed to evade talking about the constitution or responding to the more than 35 constitutional principles that were proposed by either our delegation or part of the civil society group. This needs to change because a comprehensive and sustainable political solution requires the engagement and will of all Syrians. However, this deadlock in the political process at the Syrian side's level also reflects a deadlock and a deep fissure, actually, at the international level with regards to the Syria file. Syria has really put to test the international community's commitment to empower the UN to achieve its central mission, that is to maintain international peace and security. It has also put to test the international communities, but more so that of the major powers. Specifically here, I want to talk about Russia and the US, that they can truly work together to have a positive role in resolving such conflicts instead of using them as additional battlegrounds to flex their muscles at each other. I am sad to say that what we are witnessing today is a failure of those tests of the international community. And here I want to go back to the current US administration. The Biden administration has inherited many problems from its predecessor, including coming in during what seems to be mismanagement of a pandemic and a set of internal economic problems. Of relevance, though, one of the problems that the Biden administration has inherited from its predecessor is the US's retreat from the international scene, exhibited at times blatantly through things like withdrawal from organizations like the World Health Organization or the Human Rights Council, but less obviously through tense relations with historical allies like those in the EU, which has chipped off some of the US's supremacy on the international scene. This seems to be one of the focus points of the Biden administration, to go back to having a major role on the international scene. And here I mean for it to engage positively therewith. But in doing so, it can't ignore issues at regional or country levels like the Syria file, which is directly connected to the US international position. But there are indications that the US's focus on regaining its positive image or positive role at the international level means pushing files at regional and country levels even further down its priority list. And I think that would be a grave mistake in the long term. So far, what we have seen from the US administration is that Syria is not a priority for the US. We haven't even seen assignments for top officials on the Syria file. But this is sending the wrong message to Syrians in general, and more importantly, to the regime or anyone that doesn't want to see a political solution anytime soon. And look, this also includes people who are benefiting from the war conditions on the ground. This includes warlords, which are numerous in the regime areas, but they are also present in the other parts of the country that Radwan talked about, with this de facto partition that we have going on. This also makes me, I want to remind ourselves, I guess, and everyone, that there is no solution in Syria from one side, not at the Syrian level and not at the international level, in the sense that we should not be looking at a solution where there's a winning side and a losing side, except a result where the Syrian people are the winning side. And so far, the Syrian people are the ones that are losing. This brings me to my second to last point. When looking at the Syrian level of the solution, while it might not be what most of us want to hear, let alone say, the more inclusive the political solution is, the more sustainable. This means that we might have to work with sides, and and we are already working with the regime, sides that we don't want to work with, that we don't want to negotiate with, but we have the Saudi revolution. Left out will be a spoiler, but of course there are red lines, as much as I hate to use this expression, which I think most people now also hate. And this brings me to my last point, stemming from this idea of the importance of inclusivity. The issue of continuing of full representation of women at the negotiations table. I always have to talk about this point. I don't want to cite the plethora of studies that show how much more successful and sustainable peace processes are when women are represented in greater percentages. We don't need these studies to support what we already know is the right thing to do. I think this is definitely one aspect where the opposition still needs to get things together and correct this obvious and catastrophic mistake. And last but not least, if I were to give one recommendation to the Biden administration, is to engage seriously and positively in the Syria file, specifically in the political process. And here I'm talking about at the international level, of course. This means reaching consensus with all the international actors, because this status quo will result in two main things. I think one of them is the re-emergence of ISIS, which I know is something that is very important for the US to ensure that that doesn't happen. And I think it's important for other international actors and for Syrians themselves. And the second thing is perpetuation of the de facto partition state that Syria is in right now. And I think, while there are sides that might want to see that happen, this is not what Syrians want. And these two things will have dangerous repercussions in Syria and the region. In sum, what this means is not continuing the policy that the U.S. policy, which former Syria envoy James Jeffrey said. What he said was stalemate is stability. I think that is dangerous, and what we need is quite the contrary. Thank you, and I'll be ready to answer any questions later.
Great, thank you, Dima. Actually, you covered a lot in this 10 minutes. And of course, from the mysterious war, the international community, which I guess we'll hear a lot from the concept from Yasmine later, into the Biden administrations and its priorities. Because any administration, when it comes to governance, it's all about priorities. And we'll see. But now let's move to Hamzah. We both agreed on to the de facto Syrias on Syria right now. Do you think this is the results of the stalemate that Dima mentioned, or we are still in the revolving doors of the civil war that's changing sands, as we say, because that's reflect into changing borders? Hamzah?
First of all, thank you, Dr. Radwan, for having me. And also, I would like to thank the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. for organizing these events. And I agree with Dima about in general about the internal dynamic of the Syrian conflict. But in my opinion, I don't see that there is any great change or dramatic change, at least on the ground, or at least in the international level. Do you know that I think talking about Syria, about the Syrian politics now, I think it's very simple and complex at the same time. In my opinion, that was because now, the Syrians, all Syrian peoples, or the political power in Syria interacting with their conflict as outsider, while the international and regional power deal with the conflict as an insider, because that the settlement of the conflict is relying only on the agreements between regional and international power, not relying on Syria. Well, if we decide to focus more about the internal dynamics of the Syrian conflict, at least militarily, and since March 2020. After the ceasefire agreement between Turkey and Russia, Syria has witnessed has not witnessed any great change on the military map. You, Dr. Radwan, you divided Syria into three regions, but I prefer to divide it into 5 regions. You can see it on the map. The first region is under the control of Hayat Tahrir Sham here in Idlib, and Aleppo as well, western countryside. This area enjoys good stability in terms of security, and now it witnessing a slight economic recovery because 1 year after the absence of military operation, and also due to introducing a soft tactic by Hayat Tahrir Sham, and also because the economy association to this region with the Turkish market. While the second region you see directly on the borders, it's under the control of national army battalions governing many areas in northwestern Syria and northeastern Syria. The security situation in this area is fragile, coupled with the lack of one central authority, but the economic and trading movement to this area with the Turkish is relatively good. The third area, as you know, here is held by Syrian Democratic Forces. The economic and security situation are stable to some extent with the partisan and ethnic authority. But recently, SDF started to adopt a new policy, I can say soft policy, based on gradual openness and willingness to understand and assimilate non-Kurdish community, the majority of this region, non-Kurdish community. And the fourth region, you can see it in the middle of the Syria, under indirect control of ISIS, which is struggling to reconcentrate or to reactivate itself, and try also to accumulate the jihadist legitimacy by focusing on only fighting the Syrian regime and militia. And in my opinion, because there is no plan to combat or comfort ISIS in the Syrian desert, ISIS could be able to revive itself in the near future. And the fifth area, it's under the regime control, which theoretically there is one central authority, especially in the key urban cities. But despite the city centers, there are kind of militia autonomies which govern administratively and financially also by the warlords and non-state actors. Dr. Radwan, I can say that if we look at the first three regions under Hayat Tahrir Sham, under the National Army Battalion, and under SDF, the common denominator between both of them, that they have all developed a kind of administrative structure and institution for local governing system. Despite the region under despite the region under the regime control, which which it was witnessing now, unfortunately, the collapsing of the state institution and become more and more controlling by militia autonomies more than central authority. So a part of this, in my opinion, can be attributed to many factors or to many causes. Mainly, I can mention 5. As you see, the first one, the regime economic failure and the presence of administrative incompetence in terms of reconstruction and organizing the recaptured area from the opposition. The second causes, or the second factor, in my opinion, that's the regime now is forced to reward the militia that have been formed during the war by giving them many regions to control it, where they can introduce taxes on the resident. The third reason for the state failure in Syria now, I think, is because the Russian failure in balancing Iran influence in Syria, and also the fourth one, which I can mention, the conflict between the regime elites. I will focus about this issue later, and the last one is the lack of any political solution looming in the short or the midterm. If now I will pass the first three causes or indicator, and I'm gonna focus about the conflict now between or among the regime elite. As you know, that's after 10 years of the war, a lot of significant change regarding to the economic scene. You know, that's because a great deal of the Syrian business owner has escaped the country to save their businesses. And this, as Stephen Heidman argued, and by the way, he has written very good papers about the composition of the business elites in Syria. He create a vacuum needed to be filled. At that time, anyone with the resources to found militia was able to become rich and to have ability to influence in the political output of the political process. So that's destabilize the pre-war networks and produce a new networks of losers and winners. So that's why, for example, by analyzing this, we can understand for example, the demise of Rami Makhlouf and the rise of Samer al-Fawz. By analyzing this at meso level, at least we can understand the conflict between Asma al-Assad and Rami Makhlouf. And also, Dr. Radwan, for example, an investigation report was conducted by Syria TV, has showed that at least 12 members of the current parliament has been established a military militia and participated in criminal activity throughout the war. So now we can say that we have a new business elite, we have a new political elite, and this elite try to take its place in the future of Syria, and they are competing between each other, and that's why that's what contributed to the financial or to the economic crisis, not only the economic sanction in the lately. If the first reason and the first factor that's affected the political process now in Syria, I think يعني, despite many researchers or many analysts, a lot of experts give Russia the upper hand in Syria. But I have different view. I think that Russia, after 5 years of its military intervention in Syria, has failed to balance the Iranian presence. Of course, both of countries agreed that the regime should not collapse, even militarily or financially or economically. But both of them, each of them had their own perspective, how the future or how the nature and the structure of the Syria state should be. You know that from the Russia perspective, that the key to stability is to strengthen the state institution and restoring the capacity of the state institution, while Iran is working quietly and hardly to or through the non-state actor and beyond the state institution, and to make sure to keep Syria in their culture and strategic orbit. And I think, despite even if the Israeli airstrike has been intensified last year, and there is a huge loss of the Iranian militia, especially last year, but I think that Iran succeeded in expanding its presence and its leverage in Syria last year, especially in the eastern Syria. And in my opinion, I could be wrong. In my opinion, Russia has not upper hand on the regime. Russia can only affect the regime on political issue, but while Iran has its presence on the ground and everywhere in Syria. So that's why I think that's maybe both. Maybe for example, the implicit competition between Russia and Iran could transform into explicit comfort or friction in the near future. But I don't think that Russia could do any positive role regarding to the political process in the near or in the medium future. And I think that the example of the presidential election is clear about this issue, and and also about the Constitution Committee and the negotiation. So I don't think that Russia is ready now for any political solution or to contribute in any political solution. This could contribute to the Syrian situation stay in the same status quo, and the suffering of the Syrian people, I think, will continue. Thank you so much, and I'm ready for any question.
Excellent, Hamza. Thank you very much for such mapping, because that's proof exactly what been seeing, that The Syrian conflict now transfer into a three layers conflict: international, regional, and local conflicts. And as we know, in any civil war, number of stakeholders, when the number of stakeholders increase, the years of the war will last more. And this is why, unless we have an agreement on the international, regional, local levels, we will not see an end to the conflict, unfortunately, soon. But Yasmine, let's move to you. Since February 2012, the Syrian uprising or Syrian revolution transferred into what we know in the international IHL as international armed conflict, especially Baba Amr. And this is according to the ICRC, which is considered since February 2012 the Syrian conflict as international armed conflict. And that's opened the debate, of course, the role of the international community, and is the R2P it's applied into Syria. And I remember in 2012, I've been invited into Brazil. At that time, the Ministry of Brazil was interested to reverse the R2P into responsibility while protecting, not to wait to protect, but while protecting. And then, of course, that's moved no way the actions into Syria. But let us hear from you regarding the comparison. Why in Libya the international community acted quickly and adopted the resolution 1973 under the auspices of R2P, but in Syria failed. Still, after 10 years, a number of the people been killed, refugees. It's 10 times of number in Libya or in other conflict. Floor to you, Yasmine.
Thank you, Dr. Radwan, and thanks to everyone who's with us today. So yeah, I'll talk about the international response, or maybe the lack of international response, through the prism of R2P. And for those who aren't familiar with the concept, R2P is a doctrine that basically seeks to impart multi-layered responsibilities on international actors for the sole purpose of human protection from mass atrocity crimes. And those are defined as genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And R2P basically says that primarily it's the responsibility of each and every state to protect its people from these mass atrocity crimes. And the international community should assist it through capacity building, through assistance giving, etc. And then R2P says that if prevention efforts fail and a mass atrocity situation occurs regardless, either because the state is unwilling to protect its people or it's not able to, then the responsibility should get passed on to the international community, and the international community should react through measures up to and potentially including the use of force if required. I want to stress that R2P isn't an international legal obligation, so it is not binding on countries to implement the responsibility to protect. But with that said, it's a very strong moral concept that has the support of states. So it was unanimously endorsed in 2005 in the World Summit outcome. And also many of its underlying components are binding as law. So for example, no party is permitted to commit genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or ethnic cleansing. Those are all conclusively prohibited under international law, regardless of R2P. But from the Syrian case, I think we can extract a number of very important lessons with respect to the application of R2P, which help us to fulfill that promise that was made after World War II to never again allow these atrocities to occur. And I want to focus on three main lessons today. The first lesson is that we need to do something about the veto in the Security Council. So since the Syrian conflict started over 10 years ago, Russia and China together have vetoed 16 draft resolutions on the Syrian conflict that sought to implement a range of non-military measures. Now, the Russian and Chinese arguments have been that these various draft resolutions were interventionist and that they paved the way for military intervention and regime change. but the reality can't be further from the truth. So if we look at the content of these 16 draft resolutions, only 3 of them had invoked Chapter 7, which under the UN Charter is the precursor to authorizing the use of force. But even those 3 draft resolutions were not adopted in a military context. So for example, the May 2014 draft resolution sought to refer the Syrian situation to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. The July 2012 draft resolution sought to implement a range of non-military measures, and it threatened additional measures under Article 41 of the Charter if Syria wasn't compliant. Now, importantly, Article 41 of the Charter pertains to the Security Council's non-military competencies. If the draft resolution wanted to pave the way for military intervention, it would have had to invoke Article 42 instead of 41. And similarly, the February 2017 draft resolution was also drafted in the context of Article 41, again pertaining to non-military measures. Now, the Russian and Chinese vetoes have imparted 2 main repercussions with respect to the trajectory of the Syrian conflict. The first is that they've blocked the authorization of even standard first-line responses to the conflict. So things that are as basic as travel bans or asset freezes or sanctions or arms embargoes, responses that you would see that are typical for any international response to an atrocity situation. 10 years down the road, and the Security Council hasn't even managed to adopt these. And the second repercussion is that the resolutions that the Security Council did adopt were so watered down to enlist the support of Russia and China, or at least their acquiescence so that they don't exercise their veto. So these resolutions were so watered down that they were completely unenforceable, and as a result, routinely violated and consistently broken down. And this applies across the board. So whether we're talking about establishing a supervision mission, whether we're talking about responding to chemical weapons use, which was hailed as this international success story. But the reality is that we saw that the regime continue to perpetrate chemical attacks. Whether we're talking about humanitarian access or ceasefires or a political transition, every single concept or category of violations that the Security Council has sought to deal with have completely failed because the resolutions were unenforceable. Now, I should mention that there have been initiatives since R2P was founded in 2001 to curtail or limit the use of the veto in R2P situations. But the ironic thing is that these initiatives require the support of the P5 members themselves. So the US, UK, France, Russia, and China have to themselves voluntarily agree to restrict their veto for the restrictions to actually be approved or for them to be in effect. Now, with the exception of France and potentially the United Kingdom, the P5 members will never give up such a precious power. Now, I want to pivot to the second lesson that we learned from the Syrian conflict, which is the need to strengthen the capacities of other international actors to respond to mass atrocity situations, because it's simply inconceivable that every time the Security Council is paralyzed, and Syria is by no means going to be the last one, and we've already seen paralysis with respect to Myanmar and China, etc. So it's not conceivable that every time the Security Council is paralyzed, the international community as a whole is paralyzed. So we need to strengthen the capacities of other actors to respond to atrocity situations. And in particular, I want to draw attention to the role of the General Assembly. Now, the UN Charter grants the primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security to the Security Council. And the Security Council has the right to adopt binding obligations on member states. So, for example, if the Security Council adopts sanctions, then every single member state of the United Nations must comply with these sanctions. But interestingly, the UN Charter also allocates a residual responsibility or a secondary responsibility to the General Assembly. And whereas the Security Council can adopt obligations that are binding, the General Assembly can only issue recommendations, meaning that countries don't have to implement them, but at least they have a legal justification if they do want to engage in these actions. Now, there is debate among international legal scholars over the extent to which the General Assembly can take its recommendations. And I undergo a very complex analysis in my book regarding the UN Charter provisions, which I won't do today, but suffice to say that I'm of the opinion shared by other scholars of international law that there is nothing prohibiting the General Assembly from recommending the use of force even. So in essence, we can say that the General Assembly has the competency to recommend measures up to and including the use of force if it requires or deems this necessary. So in the Syrian context, the General Assembly did exercise its residual powers here through the establishment of the IIIM, the International Impartial Independent Mechanism, which was established in December 2016. And this body has a dual-fold mandate. So first, it collects, preserves, and analyzes evidence of international crimes committed in Syria. And the second thing is that it prepares case files that can be used in other national or international jurisdictions or courts. So the IIIM is not itself a judicial body, but it can assist in terms of preparing case files for other jurisdictions. Now, the interesting thing is that when the IIIM was established by the General Assembly, this was completely unprecedented. It had never been done before. But in the 5 years since, so from 2016 until now, the General Assembly's it's established 2 additional bodies. So it's established the IIM in Myanmar, and it established UNITAD with respect to the crimes committed by ISIS. So the idea is that just because the General Assembly hasn't done something before, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have the right to do so. And I mean, it was very groundbreaking that the General Assembly engaged in the Syrian context and created the IIIM, but I think that there was room for the General Assembly to go beyond, well beyond establishing an accountability mechanism. And in this respect, I think it's helpful to think of the need to create a culture shift in the United Nations. Whereby as soon as it becomes obvious that the Security Council won't be able to respond to a particular situation, that there's this expectation that gets put on the General Assembly to respond to that situation through recommendations, which again can be non-military as well as military. Now, the third lesson that we can take from the Syrian context is the need to center international responses to mass atrocity situations through the lens of human protection. Now, any mass atrocity situation, including the Syrian one, are going to give rise to a host of repercussions and consequences. And of course, in Syria, not only do we see a humanitarian catastrophe, but we also see a refugee crisis. We see the fear of chemical weapons proliferation. We see the emergence of terrorist groups. We see the strengthened positions of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. But what we also see is that international responses have been centered on very specific consequences of the wider conflict. So for example, we have an international coalition to combat ISIS. We have European countries in particular very vested in combating the refugee crisis. We had very strong international responses to the use of chemical weapons. But what was missing was a response that is concerted and serious towards the wider underlying conflict. And what I would argue is that until the bottom line, until the underlying root cause of the conflict is addressed, the driving factor of these various consequences, the refugee crisis, the emergence of terrorist groups, etc., the driving force is going to remain in place, meaning that either we are never going to be able to address these consequences, or that they're going to require prolonged and sustained efforts and involvement by world powers. So just to summarize, in terms of national interests and countries, what we've seen in Syria is that they've been pursuing their maybe more immediate national interests by targeting these specific consequences. But the reality is that these national interests are better served by addressing and tackling the root cause of the conflict. And I'll end here, and I'm also looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Yasmine. Let me just actually reiterate here what's the Micheline Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, when she said to Myanmar military coup, that if they continue their actions, they're going actually into the bloody path of the civil war in Syria. Because exactly that's what you mentioned, Yasmine, with the lack of the international community, Syria will not be the last. we'll have other examples, and we see other countries going through. Asad, if we have actually a positive things come out from the Syrian conflict, is the role of the civil society. And I think every one of us is proud of the Syrian civil society regarding its mobility, achievement, and the role played in the last 10 years in documenting the human rights atrocities, in actually creating awarenesses and connecting with the international community after the siege imposed on Syria for almost 50 years by the Assad father and the Assad son. It was for me it was a surprise to see all of these civil society played an important role, where other actually institutions like because we don't opposition political parties or others did not play the role as we the Syrians have expected to play. Um, you've been actually one of the leading human rights and civil society activists. Tell us more about the role of civil society and your participation in the last conference, in the Brussels conference, which tried actually to create and to raise fund to the Syrian humanitarian crisis. Asad, floor is you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Radwan, and thank you for the Arab Center. Indeed, probably the Syrian civil society is the last defense line to protect whatever is left of the Syrian fabric altogether. And I'm more specifically referring to the community-based organizations that exist in the different areas of Syria today, and to different diaspora organizations that are working with the refugee communities wherever they are, whether in neighboring countries or beyond. And their work not only as first responders to the humanitarian crisis, but also as human rights advocates, as violation documenters, as advocates of the causes, the rights of these people. It has been of prime essence over the past 10 years. And I guess one last thing to highlight is over the past 3 years is the development of victim organizations, whether we're talking about the Families for Freedom, which focuses on the arbitrary detention, and or we're talking about the Caesar Families Association, which is also focusing on it's a group of the families of the victims of that were photographed by Caesar, or we're talking about the victim association of ISIS, and that focuses on the people that have been detained and arbitrarily detained by ISIS and have been disappeared ever since. So I think this development is quite good news. It's quite good news because it's bringing a victim-centered narrative into the discussion of Syrian civil society, rather than more of a practical, business-minded narrative, which was dominating for a while. But to start with, I guess we need to acknowledge the first role that Syrian civil society has been playing over the past 10 years, which is a humanitarian role and the role of first responders. Although this is not something new to Syria, I mean, charities have existed even before the Ba'ath Party came to power. We're talking about mainly faith-based charities around mosques and churches that were doing some humanitarian work to alleviate poverty, etc. Their role shrank significantly since the Ba'ath Party came to power in 1963, and almost evaporated with the arrival of Hafez al-Assad in 1970, and more obviously even more so in 1982 after the massacre in Hama and basically the complete control of the vast structures on anything related to civil society, whether we're talking about charities or professional associations, trade unions, syndicates, etc. However, there was still small, like charities continuing to work. That has exploded, as you mentioned, post 2011, especially post 2012, as the humanitarian needs increased significantly with the barbaric, violent response of the regime to peaceful protests. And civil society has been playing, or civil society actors have been playing the role of first responders, whether it's on the humanitarian, on the medical field, or whether it's on the like food safety, or whether it's shelter, or you name it, all the different sectors of the humanitarian work. And what makes it even more interesting is the fact that there are no international organizations that do first response in a lot of areas in Syria. So it is through Syrian organizations that the hundreds of millions of dollars that are pledged every year that are being spent. Now, that doesn't mean that Syrian organizations get the billions that we hear in Brussels. First, those billions are pledges rather than actual expenditures. Although when you look at the financial track, most of the countries actually meet their pledges. But once the humanitarian business model kicks in, you have the money that goes from the donor to the international agency, whether it's a UN or an international organization, and then you have the cut for overhead. Then it goes from there into the implementer, and then you have another cut for overhead. And then from the implementer to the actual organization on the ground, that's a third cut for overhead, and so on and so forth. So from probably the billions of dollars that we hear have been given as assistance to the Syrian people, and that's a guesstimate, it's not scientific, but only about 30 to 33% of that amount actually makes it to the end beneficiary. About 67 of that is gone meanwhile in transition from the donor into the end beneficiary. So if we say 50 or let's say $100 billion have been spent overall on the Syrian crisis from 2011 until now, only about $33 billion of those have actually reached Syrians at the end. Now, obviously, humanitarian aid does create economic cycles as well, because by the overheads, you're paying humanitarian workers. Those humanitarian workers are spending money. So I'm not taking into consideration, obviously, when I say these amounts, the different economic cycles that are created or are a byproduct of the humanitarian aid itself. And interestingly, also, these first responders have not only appeared in opposition-held areas. They exist in all areas that Hamzah so clearly explained to us earlier, whether we're talking about SDF-held areas or regime-held areas or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or the Syrian National Army. They're all over the place. And a common structure or a common denominator for all of them is that they operate in limbo. They don't operate under a clear legal environment. If we look at Syria, the association law dates to 1958. It's archaic, and it's kind of been suspended by the different states of emergency that have been declared since 1963. Now, obviously, the state of emergency was lifted in 2012, but then replaced by the Mahkamat al-Irhab, by the Court of Terrorism. So there's always the risk of being accused of being a terrorist as a humanitarian worker. And then in other areas, obviously, there's no legal framework either, whether we're talking northeast or northwest of the country, which complicates several things. It complicates the establishment, the institutionalization of these organizations. It complicates financial transfers. It also complicates access. Moving on from the purely humanitarian role that these organizations have played, a more visible to the international community role is the human rights documentation and the advocacy role that a lot of Syrian civil society organizations have played. And these are mainly civil society organizations either operating in out of Turkey or out of neighboring countries, so whether Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, or civil society organizations that are operating in Europe or elsewhere. It's very difficult today for a Syrian civil society organization based in any area of Syria to clearly advocate for human rights or for any of the rights or roles that it should be doing. And that's why a lot of the organizations like Baytna or like other organizations that are in the neighboring countries or in Europe are playing the role of the messenger, basically, and trying to elevate the voices that we get from the ground when it comes to the different violations. What also we invest a lot in is the bridging between organizations operating in different areas. So if you're operating, let's say, in the Turkish-held areas, you can't speak of the atrocities that are happening in Afrin, but you can definitely pass the message to organizations that are operating in SDF areas, and they will be able to talk about the atrocities happening in Afrin, and vice versa. If you're an organization operating in Raqqa or in Deir ez-Zor, it's very hard for you to talk about the exactions committed by SDF or by the YPG or by SIS or any military structure that exists in the area. But you can easily pass the message to organizations operating in the northwest of the country, and they can do the advocacy. So investing a lot in this cross bridging of the different areas and trying to make sure that the messaging is moving freely among the three areas is quite important. Equally with organizations obviously based in regime areas, it's a bit more tricky it's a bit trickier with organizations based in government or in regime areas because you run two extra risks when you talk to organizations based in regime areas. The first one is the risk of being co-opted. You never know whether there is never 100% certainty that this organization is 100% a Syrian civil society organization and not some regime-linked or Khabarat-linked organization. You will never be able to 100% ascertain that. So there's always a small risk of being co-opted. That's one. And the second risk is obviously the risk that you're putting on them by talking to them. So you need to make sure that you have all the necessary firewalls in place, you have all the VPNs, and I mean all the protection is put in place to minimize the risk for them talking to us in other areas of Syria. But so the role of advocacy and human rights has played a big role in several things. One, in making sure that the confidence building measures in 2254 are put in place and are clear and are non-negotiable, making sure that CBMs are not something that the regime can come and negotiate. Now, is it implemented or not? That's a different story, but at least in the text of it, the CBMs are non-negotiable. Making sure that the issue of detainees is always on the table, regardless of what format we're under. Also pushing very hard the Office of the Special Envoy not to basically get too much into the political arena, let's say, of Syrian opposition and Syrian regime, but also take a wider array of voices or a wider array of opinions into consideration. And that's the last point I wanted to touch on, is the role of Syrian civil society in the political process. And that role can be summarized by two things. very quickly. The first is the participation of Syrian civil society or members of Syrian civil society in the civil society support room, which is a mechanism established by the Office of the Special Envoy to consult with members of Syrian civil society, but also the middle third, the famous middle third that exists in the Constitutional Committee. Now, is that really representative of Syrian civil society? There's a big debate about that. And how do you actually choose the middle third? When we look at the Sochi communique, it talked about the UN having the mandate, basically, to put the names of the middle third. What happened in reality is negotiations between the Syrian regime and well, through its representative Russia and the Syrian opposition, who with the leadership of the special envoy, to basically come to an agreement on 50 names. When you look at the 50 names, I would say not more than 20 or 21 are true representatives of civil society, regardless of what political affiliation they have. I'm not talking about their political affiliation here, but I'm talking about whether they're true representatives of this community they were coming from. But these are kind of the two tools of engagement that civil society has with the political process. They're not perfect. They have many shortcomings, but they're important. And I think the role that civil society has when it comes to the political process is not limited to these two tools, but also has a much bigger and wider role from outside these UN mechanisms to put pressure on the UN, to put pressure on all parties as well, to make sure that the rights and the interests of the people Syrian civil society work for are not forgotten. So whether these are the victims or the beneficiaries of the programs that these organizations are offering, we need to make sure that their rights and interests are protected. And the mechanisms that are offered by the UN are not the only mechanisms that exist. We can obviously use mechanisms from outside, and that would be my first recommendation probably to the US administration when it comes to working with Syrian civil society, is to look at mechanisms outside the scope of the UN, not necessarily the CSSR or the middle third, but also other scopes to impact the political process, to make sure that rights and interests are protected, but also to make sure that Syrian civil society is funded and Syrian civil society continues to exist. And I think that's the biggest risk at the moment, with the donor fatigue and the Syria fatigue more generally. Interest in supporting civil society is going down, when needs are increasing significantly. And we saw that at the last Brussels conference. The amounts pledged went down by about $1.5 billion when needs have increased significantly in all areas of Syria. So there is a need for rebalancing, and I think the US has a prime role to play in that as well. So that would be the second recommendation, is to significantly increase support to Syrian civil society, financial support, so that needs are met and Syrian civil society is able to continue to play the important role it has been playing over the past 10 years. And thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Assaad. We have only actually 20 minutes left. This is why I need your help. I will ask question for each one of you, and if you answer actually just in 1 minute, try. I know it's but we got a lot of question we need to have answers to. My first question to Dima. You said the Biden administration come into office will prepare to do actions in Yemen. From the day one, actually, they appoint a special envoy to Yemen. and then also they cut all the military assistance to Saudi Arabia. But they failed to do anything similar to Syria. Now it's almost 90 days when Biden in the White House, and we don't see any. They downgraded the Syrian crisis into just a humanitarian crisis, and we see the Secretary of State Blinken gave very emotional and powerful speech at the UN. It's no doubt about it, but he actually did not mention any actions that the U.S. administration can take if Russia actually vetoed, which everyone expects to do so in next July regarding the border force. Why is that, and how you explain that, Dima?
You know, that's a really complex question, and you give me only 1 minute. You know, this is to me, it's not something new. I think it's been a few years that we have seen the U.S. administration. You know, the rhetoric is great, it's wonderful, and there is almost no action. And here, I just don't want to be misunderstood, because I have been in the past. We're not talking about military action. We're talking about the diplomatic and political level. And I think it's just that. You know, until now, the U.S. is definitely seeing this whole policy of stalemate stability as truly what it, you know, what benefits it. Because if it, you know, until now, I think they're not getting out of the mentality of an action means more. On, you know, they don't want to do that, but honestly, we don't want that either. As Syrians, we don't want more. You know, if anything, we want to get all the military people out, all these militaries, all these armies outside of Syria. But I don't think they're, you know, they're yet, and there's no will to engage at the political and diplomatic level, at the, you know, at the level that is needed to resolve the problem in Syria. And, you know, considering its location, and I know this is said so many times that people almost don't believe it anymore, but it is. And it's not just related to Israel. It's, you know, in the region as a whole. You know, I don't think the U.S. is ready yet to take any action. And, you know, the status quo is still working out. It's not causing any problems at home by sending more troops, but at the same time, it's not giving up anything. So it's doing this. But like I said in my you know, in my recommendation, I don't think stalemate is stability. Eventually, it's going to cause things to explode, and it's going to have very dangerous repercussions in the region, and I think on the U.S. as well.
Thank you, Dima. Thank you, Yasmine. You focus too much on your presentation on with the lack of actions from the Security Council. Let's move to the General Assembly. In 1974, the General Assembly, they freeze the seat of the apartheid South African regime at that time. Did not expel the South African government at that time, what was apartheid, but they seized the seat of the government from doing any activities within the General Assembly or within the UN agencies. Why is that is not an option in the Syrian case? At least we have 9 or 10 actually General Assembly resolutions regarding the human rights violations in the Syrian Arab Republic. Can the General Assembly move a step beyond the establishing the IIIM into freezing the seat of the Syrian government?
Thanks, Dr. Radwan. I think this goes back to one of the points that I was making about a culture shift in the United Nations. Because if we come right now and say, what can the General Assembly do now? I think it's way too late. But one of the things that I advocate for is for that culture shift, so that as soon as it becomes obvious that there's going to be paralysis from the Security Council, that the General Assembly can start considering, you know, can start considering a situation and gradually build up the recommendations to make them more robust as needed. And certainly freezing the assets, sanctions, certainly these can fall under the remit of some of the recommendations that the General Assembly can make. Now, one more thing I want to point out is that the General Assembly is also a political body like the Security Council. So there will be an aspect of politicization. So for example, you could fail to get a 2/3 required vote from the General Assembly as required to make a recommendation. The General Assembly could make a recommendation and it's not implemented by anyone. But I think that expectation and that avenue is still worth exploring. And if there was a mandate from the General Assembly to engage in a particular action, it would put a lot more political pressure on international powers to at least do something, and make it harder for them to justify or to hide behind the veto as an excuse for inaction.
Thank you, Yasmine. Now, Assaad, I have theoretical questions, if I'm saying. We know since actually the concept of the civil society, especially in Eastern Europe, played an important role in the transformation and the transition into democratic countries. Most of the donation and the support from the international community transit into the civil society. And this is the case in Iraq in 2003, and this is the case of Syria in 2011. But what I noticed that with a lot of funding to the civil society is nothing left to the opposition political institutions. The civil society in Syria get funding 10 times of what the coalition, and Dima can correct here, can get, or the Syrian interim government. That in a way actually did not help the transition in a way, because what will, as you mentioned, what will lead the transition in any way, the political institutions. It can be in the opposition or in the government. By lack of funding to those political institutions in the opposition, was unable to govern, unable actually to execute their responsibilities and power over their areas. And instead of that the civil society is flourishing, but was unable to establish. And I know also you've been part of the coalition in 2012 and 13 as an advisor. What's your thought about that?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, not only that, it created an unhealthy relationship between the nascent civil society and the different opposition bodies, whether it's the coalition or the interim government. It also, and more importantly, with the local councils, with the different local administrative councils that were flourishing in areas outside the control of Assad. That healthy relationship went to the point where there was competition among over authorities and who has authority to do what, and that has been very, very nefast to the entire governance structure in the areas under control of the opposition. Now, definitely we can blame the donors for this, and for donors engaging in giving civil society organizations roles that should not belong to them, whether it's in the judicial sector, or whether it's in policing, or whether it's in local governance. But there's also a lack of understanding from some Syrian civil society actors on their priorities and what they want to do and what their roles are and what their roles are not, more importantly. And that has also to do with the fact that for 60 years, there was no freedom of assembly in Syria. So we are all learning while doing, which is, and we don't have a history of a civic movement. So we definitely fell into many mistakes, and with the void that the regime created by withdrawing all its services from areas it lost control of, everyone was kind of fighting over who's going to fill in the void, and that created that unhealthy relationship you mentioned. So definitely donors are to blame on one side, but also how we Syrians behaved and the unnecessary competition and lack of definition of roles and responsibilities led further into this problematic relationship.
Thank you, Assaad. I'm glad actually we agree on this. Hamza, as we agreed that the Syrian conflict now became 3 layers conflict: international, regional, and locals. What approach actually the international community, again, the word of the international community, can end the conflict in Syria? Because what everyone now in Syria believe that the international community is managing the conflict rather than actually ending the conflict or solving or transforming the conflict into stable peace, as we say. The United States tried under the Obama administration with the creating the ISSG, the International Syria Support Group, trying to bring all the players, stakeholders, 20 countries, nations, including Iran, into the table. And unfortunately did not produce much because of the conflicting agendas and the interests among these 20 states on what the shape of Syria should be. What approach you recommend actually to the Biden administration should take regarding resolving the Syrian conflict, or it will be for us for a long time as a frozen conflict, as the conflict in Cyprus or Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or what?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. I think the answer is very complicated. It's not simple answer. I don't know if I know the answer, how to answer to this question, but I think that's the international community, if we can say international community, yeah. It's managing the conflict, not, there is no will, and there is no ability also now on this at this time to resolve the Syrian conflict. I think that's until now, Biden administration doesn't have the information, doesn't have update about the Syrian conflict, and try to get updated about the Syrian conflict, what's going on. But until now, if we want to talk about a realistic issue, there is 2 ways. Unfortunately, I want to say that the first way is through sanction, economic sanction. I know the economic sanctions, especially after Caesar, is impacting are impacting the Syrian civilians, but it's affecting the structure of the regime, the core elite of the regime for the first time. So, and as you know, Dr. Radwan, Iran, especially last year, supported the regime financially by a big amount of money, and Russia trying also to support it financially, but in return for contracts or especially in the gas field or something like. But in the long term, I don't think that the regime sponsor will be able to support the regime financially. So I think intensifying the economic sanction and through selective approach that mitigate its impact on the civilian level could be realistic. And also that's Obama administration and also all the European or Western states could be also support the political process by put a condition to any reconstruction process, that to link this reconstruction by the reconstruction process by the achieving of or any progress in the political on the peaceful settlement or political settlement of the conflict. And also at least Biden administration can put pressure on some Arab countries that try to normalize or to re-legitimate the regime again, especially in the Arab League. So at least it's very important now to cut the way to any re-legitimization of the regime, especially at the Arabic level. This is in my opinion.
Thank you, Hamza. We got a lot of questions. That's a good thing, but unfortunately, we don't have the time even to read these questions. I will read actually some of the questions, and I really apologize for all the ones who put their questions. And then any of you actually can pick any of the questions in 1 minute. Again, we have a question from Samir regarding is the hope that sanctions might provoke internal opposition or renewed protest misplaced? The questions regarding that, may the sanctions create a movement within the inside Syria, can make a leverage for the international community to change Bashar Assad calculation on the ground? The second question from Dr. Abdul Wahab Al-Qassab at the Arab Center, do you think that both Russians and the Americans are using minorities, especially the Kurds, in a way which is harmful to the national integrity of Syria? Then also a questions, do you see a regional package deal, especially now the United States, it's engaging with the negotiations with Iran over the nuclear program, or it can Syria left over as what happened in the last deal during the Obama administration? Another questions, lack of the political solution, the failure of the Geneva Convention in Syria. What do you think should be taken to revive the political process, including sort of reconciliation? Another question from Khalil Jahjan, Arab Center. You recommend to Biden administration to consider serious engagement in Syria. This question to Dima. What constitutes serious engagement by your recommended in Syria? What specific steps or measures do you recommend? Another questions to Yasmine, do you give more background to R2P origin, history, especially the question raised that the leftist has a culture of belief that the R2P is imperialist policy against the third war or something like that. And then questions that is there a direct way for the US to financially support the civil society? And let's everyone have, if we can, just 1 minute, because we have to end by 12:30 DC time. We'll start from Hamza.
Yeah, I think about there's the failure of Geneva. I said that Dr. Abdul Wahab, that there is no will and ability for international community now to involve, but only now it's very important now to focus again about the support of the political Syrian opposition again and the civil society to continue to continue their struggle against the authoritarian regime in Syria. And also regarding to the media platform, I think now after the military defeat and after the failure of political process, now it's very important for the Western state and the United States to support the media platform, because the majority of media platforms that established after the Syria revolution have been closed recently due to the financial problem. I think that's after the military defeat, after the deadlock of the political process, now the battle is now about the narrative, and it's very important that to keep our narrative alive or ongoing in this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamza. Assaad?
Thank you. There are different ways of obviously supporting Syrian civil society, whether it's through Syrian civil society structures that exist already in the US. I mean, you have many medical, the first thing that comes to my mind is the Syrian-American Medical Society, which is a medical relief organization that operates in different areas of Syria. So, but there are other Syrian US charities, and this is not the only one. Or you can support Syrian organizations in Europe, or obviously supporting Syrian organizations in Turkey. Unfortunately, direct transfers into Syria are not possible, neither from the US nor from Europe at the moment. But Syrian organizations have developed mechanisms basically to ensure that are fully transparent and fully compliant with all different sanction regimes. And I second definitely what Hamza has just said. The next battle is the battle of narratives, and we should not let the regime win that battle. So continued support to media and to Syrian civil society is of essence to be able to make sure that the narrative remains alive. Thank you very much.
Yasmine?
I'll take the question on R2P. And the short answer is that the ideas that we need to protect populations from mass atrocity crimes are agreed by all countries across the board. So even Russia and China, when they expressed skepticism regarding international motivations or Western motivations on Syria, they would still affirm the protection principles of R2P. So they would still condemn violations committed in Syria, whether on, even in October 2011, when Russia exercised its first veto, it stressed very specifically that we are not with, or we do not condone the actions of the Assad regime. But the disagreement regarding R2P regards how can it be implemented, or how should it be implemented. And this was even a disagreement that emerged on Libya with respect to allegations of mission creep. So basically, the problem is, how do we implement R2P, not the values that underpin the doctrine.
Yasmine, final word, Dima?
Thank you, Dr. Radwan. And, I'm going to go back to the question about what can the Biden administration do. And I'm actually going to tie it to the question that you asked, Hamza, which is about also about what they can do with regards to the political process. And you actually mentioned the ISSG, and I'm so glad that you did, because the ISSG, if we remember, had the Vienna meetings in October and November of 2015, and the outcomes of that exactly were the reason, and they were formalized in Security Council Resolution 2254. So this is a great example of that. When the international community comes together, it can achieve something and push forward the political process. Since then, we haven't seen something similar. What we have seen is actually the division of almost that entire group into two groups, which is the Astana group and the small group. And what we need to see now is to bring again those two together, because since 2015 until now, what we have seen is that they have been more a sort of competition, and that hasn't yielded really very good results. So I think one of the things that the Biden administration can do is contribute to bringing back these two groups together and making 2254, which has all the steps that are needed for the political process and political transition into concrete and tangible steps that are implementable, so that we can go forward and hopefully get out of this crisis soon. Thank you.
Hopefully soon. Thank you, Dima. Thank you. A great discussion. You gave us a lot of thoughts and ideas to think about it and to write about it. Since we are at the Arab Center, we do policy briefing every week. And then, of course, Syria, it's up into our interest and the center of our interest. Thank you again. And hopefully we'll have another round of discussion if we see any actions or any change in the mapping as Hamzah pointed out. Thank you again.